first of all, to thank our 4 panelists for accepting the invitation of Policy Center of the New South to participate to this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And this is a contribution of the Policy Center of the New South to this commemoration of this anniversary of the creation of the United Nations as a stronghold of international peace and security. To mark this important anniversary, PCNS has scheduled 4 webinars. Today's webinar will address the issue of peace and security. It will be followed by one on cooperation for economic and social development, then a third one on the contribution of the United Nations system to the protection and promotion of human rights. And last but not least, the role of the United Nations in addressing the challenge of climate change. Today's session will be focused on peace and security. We all know that when the United Nations was created in 1945, the main and the major objective that have been assigned to this universal organization was to prevent a 3rd World War and to work towards preventive diplomacy in order to reduce the risk of conflicts in the different regions of the world. One of the tools that the United Nations has been developing since the 50s is the peacekeeping operations, which is a mechanism that is not provided for in the Charter, but has been so far proven to be a very crucial and very important instrument to establish peace, to maintain peace, and to consolidate peace. But peace and security is a common objective of the UN, but also to the African Union and its regional economic commissions. We will, of course, expect our panelists to address also the cooperation between the United Nations and the regional arrangements provided for in the Chapter 8 of the Charter of the UN and the contribution of the African Union to peace and security in the continent. And finally, given the interaction between development, human rights, and peace, we will expect our esteemed panelists to address a role in this comprehensive approach of peace and security and identify the obstacle and the challenges that the United Nations has to face. To cover these dimensions of peace and security and the role of the United Nations, I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Yonas Adeto, who is the director of the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, Mr. Rida Lyammouri, Senior Fellow of the Policy Center of the New South, Mr. Leonardo Parraga, Executive Director of the Bogotart Foundation, who is one of the 500 emerging leader of the Policy Center of the New South, and Salma Daoudi, who is a researcher in the Policy Center of the New South. We will have 1 hour discussions, which will take place in 2 parts. And I will invite, first of all, Mr. Adeto to initiate the the debate. He will be followed by Mr. Rida Lyammouri, Salma Daoudi, and Leonardo Parraga. Thank you for your participation.
I'd like to thank you very much indeed. It is truly an honor and a privilege to share my thought on the UN at 75, or the 75th anniversary of the United Nations since its establishment. And as it's been already very clearly outlined by the esteemed moderator, that it came out as human innovation to live together, not to repeat another scourge of war. Again, seeing humanity being decimated by fellow humanity, so as to deter such things from happening in the future, then setting up that excellent organization. I would say excellent simply because we don't really have any other option than having the United Nations. So as an agent, universal or global agent for humanity, to save from humanity at the same time, to be honest. And again, before we make our planet post-human species planet, I think its existence is extremely important. So I was very much interested. Of course, my focus was on 3 points. The first one on the background, followed by what's meant by peace and security in our understanding, and finally, what should be done for the United Nations in the future so as to be more resilient and at the same time to really stand for the quality of human lives. But when that African-led solution for African problems, I think that adds to what I have prepared, sort of a spice. So I might possibly touch upon that too. So I think the first one has been already taken care of. That is, why United Nations? So for us in Africa, when we talk about peace and security, we possibly talk in terms of not simply absence of war or violence or conflict, but presence of justice, development, equality, engagement, human dignity. So that definitely is what's meant by, for us, peace and security. And particularly if I detach security from peace and take security per se, I like to focus on 3 pillars: that what is being threatened, that is a referent object. So in this time, I'm not simply making reference to states per se or high security, but human beings as a whole, as a center of the gravity. So the second one is the source of threat. What are these sources? The sources could be not only from fellow human beings, but also from global pandemic like the one now we are facing today, such as coronavirus or climate disaster. And sometimes also some people taking climate to be simply hoax. So lack of, I feel like, multilateralism or lack of global leadership or global governance, so seriously speaking, as source of threat. So the third pillar for me is the way out from that. That is, what can we then do if the one being threatened is human being, if the source of threat is both natural and human, if we all are in need of escaping this danger, even though the United Nations itself couldn't stop this, then what should we do? How can we refocus ourselves? And so then security for us is emancipation threat and survival threat. This survival threat, of course, is the one I've just tried to mention because we were given only 5 to 7 minutes, as I have looked at. So then I should very quickly hasten to move on to the emancipation threat. That is social threat. Particularly women in some cultures are degraded. Women's issues were as secondary issues. They should be emancipated. And political emancipation that we are talking about, that is tyranny and not accepting human rights. So everywhere human rights degraded, it is everywhere that human rights are threatened. And maybe the third threat for us is the material threat, such as lack of food, such as lack of job, guarantee, particularly in this time that we all really are suffering, particularly from this COVID-19. So these are the threats. And then when we talk about security, then being safe from these threats as well. So as I said, I may not go to the detailed science and art of it, but I just focus then on the UN, a stronghold of international peace and security, then can really, the UN can live up to its name. And I think I would suggest three things if it wants to stand for the very name, the United Nations. Okay, right? The United Nations not only simply state security, that's coming together, but the citizens, the global people, the human beings as a whole, the humanity as a whole. Number one, accept that we are diverse. Cultural diversity, attitudinal diversity, perspective diversities. Diversity here, I'm referring to this one-size-fits-all attitude should be challenged. So liberalizing economy and democratizing politics as a way out, but rather when you come to Middle East, when you come to Africa, when you go to China, you should not really recommend the way you would exercise it in the United States or in the United Kingdom. Accept that difference, that there are alternative ways to deal with differences and of course human dignity. So that is the first one. Embrace that as I am. I'm Black, I'm African, I am at this level, or I'm a woman, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim, I'm atheist, accept him as I am. Not rather impose on me, but let's have interaction together. Neither top down nor bottom up, but interaction. That is quite important for us. If the United Nations then wants to survive, needs to survive, if we're to celebrate the 100th anniversary of it, then it should accept these human differences. Second one, we need multilateralism for military, if you like, for climate, if you like, for entire survival, multilateralism, not unilateralism. We can't really ignore climate issues. We can't ignore global pandemic as we have already now witnessed in the whole world. So this multilateralism should come back again. It should be promoted in our dealings, in our education, in our trade, in our international relations. And thirdly, reform the United Nations in its entirety, particularly include people from countries from Middle East, from Africa, from Latin America. These, I'm very happy our distinguished moderator mentioned peacekeeping operations, peace support operations. The contribution of, for instance, my country, Ethiopia, as you can just check, it's number one in contributing both as TCC, troop contributing country, the police, the military, civilians, you can see. Africa is really contributing as a whole in global security governance. However, it's no permanent seat in the UN Security Council. So seriously speaking, because you are paying by your blood, then why don't you be in these decision-making areas? So these countries, the global South in general, must be taken into account. If United Nations to be named as United Nations, then let it unite the nations together. I think I should end there. If there are questions, I'll be more than happy to come back. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Adeto, and I agree with you that security is not physical security, is not the security of the territory. But when we refer to security, we refer to human security in which a human being, regardless of its origin, of its culture, of its race, of its color, is the center of public policy, unity, the equity, and the justice. I would like to invite Lyammouri to share with us his thoughts.
Thank you, Loulichki, and thank you, Mr. Yonas, for your presentation and setting up the floor for a very interesting discussion. And it was a good start, so I can dive into a more very specific peacekeeping operation. And based on my experience working mainly on the Sahel region, looking into the conflicts happening in the region, specifically Mali, where we have one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, peacekeeping operation, MINUSMA, and also maybe also the deadliest mission. That now, I think it's been 7 years since been implemented. So I would like to just provide a very quick assessment on the mission and also some of the lessons learned very quickly. And personally, if I have to provide an assessment, I will divide it on the two time frames. I will look at it from when it started in 2013 to 2016, and then from 2016 to today. So that being said, and I think the peacekeeping, mission, a stabilization mission in Mali struggled early on, and not because they didn't have the resources, but I think because they were mobilized quickly and they had to get mobilized quickly. And it goes back to our points, African solutions for African problems. The main reason that MINUSMA had to be mobilized quickly is because the African Union, ECOWAS, were very slow to react to the conflict in Mali. And speaking to MINUSMA leadership back in 2013, or a year later, they said we had no idea where we are walking into. So there was that learning curve. So they needed that time to learn of what's going on in Mali, and we continue to learn to this day. So it's very complex issue. So we can say that they struggled early on, but at the same time they registered some success. Especially on bringing in the different actors and the northern Malian armed groups with the Malian government to sign an agreement, peace accord, and then bring in some stabilization to the north, and the violence between different armed groups have decreased, and the protection of civilians improved. Yet was not perfect, but at least was improved. And let's also remember that when they moved into to Mali, a lot of resources were spent on protecting themselves rather than protecting just the civilians in Mali, because of the presence of violent extremist organizations. So they are repeatedly targeted, and also which put burden on their efforts to protect civilians in Mali. So that's one of the reasons I see it as a success, but also very limited success. And then I'll move on. And since after the signing of the peace accord in 2015, I would say, and then now I'm talking about the time frame from 2016 to now, I think MINUSMA have not done a very good job in terms of the implementation of the peace accord. I think 5 years later, we are still seeing that the Malian government have not returned to northern Mali. They don't, MINUSMA and the UN in general and the international community in general are not putting enough pressure on all the actors so they can bring northern Mali to the situation that everyone wants. So I side myself with MINUSMA, and I feel their challenges, because when they went to Mali, they were mainly, their mandate was just focused on northern Mali. But then by 2016, situation deteriorated drastically in central Mali, and it was not included in their mandate to operate to involve central Mali in their operation until June of 2018. The situation at that point was already catastrophic in central Mali, and now we are seeing, and all this goes back to your point, Dr. Yonas. It's the result of all these factors and sources of issues and conflicts, injustice, human rights violations, etc., and competition over natural resources. So all these issues, and MINUSMA had to navigate all these issues, all this in addition to the recent coup d'etat that happened in Mali. So it's a very, very difficult environment, and that's why I think from 2016 to now, I think this situation has further deteriorated, but not necessarily because of MINUSMA, but also because they're just not prepared to deal with such complex and diverse issues that are related not just to violent extremist organizations, but now we have inter-community tensions, inter-community issues. In addition to violent extremist organizations in Central Mali, we also saw the emergence of ethnic-based armed groups, which continue to divide communities, and therefore it's very, very difficult to stabilize and bring everyone to the table. And on top of that, you add also human rights violations, not just by these groups, but also by the Malian army and state authorities. And MINUSMA had to navigate these issues as well. So, and going forward, now, those are the issues that we know. And I think to improve MINUSMA's and the UN efforts in general, I think also have to look at the new challenges that are coming up. Like, as you mentioned, Dr. Yonas, like the climate issues. But now we also have seen, just in the Sahel region, we have probably about 1.5 million displaced population. So in addition to humanitarian crisis, we're going to see competition over natural resources, competition over job opportunities between the displaced population and the host communities. All these issues, I think the UN need to anticipate and plan for ahead of time before things happen. So I think that's one thing that I want to see the UN doing going forward. And then going back to the peacekeeping operations, I think when you talk about African countries are the main contributors to MINUSMA, for example, in Mali. The capacity is the gap between African peacekeepers and then the European peacekeepers, for instance, it's enormous. The capabilities and the number of casualties among the African peacekeepers is much, much higher than those of the European or other countries in the world. So I think enhancing the capacity of African peacekeepers contribution is also one solution that could help going forward. And I will stop here and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Lyammouri. I hope that Mr. Parraga will not mind if I floor to Salma Daoudi first. I don't want to be criticized of not taking into consideration the gender balance. So I will invite Salma to make her contribution, and the last word, at least at this stage of the discussions, will be Mr. Parraga's consideration of the issue. So Salma, if Leonardo wouldn't mind, I invite you to make your contribution.
Many thanks, Ambassador. I'm very honored to participate to this relevant debate alongside our esteemed guests, and really thank you for your contributions. So today I have chosen to focus specifically on US peacekeeping operations in the face of the evolving nature of warfare, as well as the extent to which this role could be challenged by COVID-19. So for years, 75 years, the United Nations has really existed as a bastion of hope, as an organization that the international community has turned to in order to prevent, de-escalate, and diffuse conflicts. However, we have noticed that the nature of conflicts itself has evolved over the years. So the main security threats today stem from matters such as terrorism, poverty, illness, all of those which the original setup of the UN did not necessarily account for, and which in part explains why we had the emergence of human security in 1994, which sort of encompasses all of those economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political threats the interrelation of which often drives conflict and warfare. So while the absolute number of armed conflicts has been decreasing since the end of the Cold War, we noticed that this trend concerns mostly the decrease of conflicts between rather than within states. So civil conflicts continue to form a predominant source of violence and instability. And this asymmetrical warfare is a bit more difficult to address and even to prevent without encroaching on state sovereignty. But the UN's fundamental architecture, as I said earlier, is more geared towards the resolution of interstate conflicts. So ideological contentions and fights for self-determination, rebellion, these fundamentally challenge statehood and are driven by a zero-sum logic, which drastically decreases the likelihood of securing compromise. So it is in this context that the Security Council has mandated peacekeeping missions and operations, which, while not explicitly mentioned in the UN Charter, emerged as really one of the most effective tools available to the UN in order to assist host countries to navigate the path from conflict to peace. So resting in a sort of holy trinity of consent, minimal use of force, and impartiality, these operations really were a compromise respecting state sovereignty while also upholding collective security. So there have been 71 UN peacekeeping operations since 1948, 13 of which are still currently deployed. Not all peacekeeping operations are conducted by the UN. So as mentioned earlier, in many cases, it is regional alliances or organizations that step in order to stabilize conflict zones. But the focus here really is on those directly conducted by the UN. And it is also important to note that there has been an evolution in the width of the mandate given to UN peacekeeping operations. So early peacekeeping operations were mostly limited to maintaining ceasefires and stabilizing situations on the ground. But today we see that their traditional scope was extended to multi-dimensional missions, not only to maintain peace and security, but also to facilitate political processes and democratic transitions, protect civilians and human rights, assist in disarmament, provide humanitarian relief, which is also a very important function of the UN for a lot of those social services that the UN or its agencies provide in conflict zones are essential to alleviating at least a little bit of the grievances of the host population. And overall, these missions really try and seek to promote the rule of law. And so COVID-19 appears as a threat multiplier, right? So these operations have been indiscriminately disrupted by COVID-19, which has been critically destructive and deadly, even in most stable high-income countries. So the disease has ever greater potential to wreak havoc in fragile states, trigger unrest, exacerbate the depth of governance crisis, and this raises concern about potential violence escalation and multi-dimensional insecurity. So conflict-ridden countries possess limited means of implementing social distancing measures to halt the virus spread, as well as fewer healthcare facilities. Years of conflict have essentially eroded the resilience of many national health systems around the world, rendering them profoundly ill-equipped to deal with an epidemic of the scale of COVID-19. And so the pandemic really risks fraying social cohesion, providing an opportunity for armed groups to provide social services in certain countries in order to gain momentum and popular support, and further disrupting access to healthcare. Additionally, we have also seen resulting food insecurity, economic recession, all of which are likely to leave many fragile governments facing budgetary crisis, mass unemployment, and elevated levels of public distrust. So this creates a perfect storm of opportunity for the proliferation of both diseases and violence, which is something that we've seen, for example, in 2019 in DRC with the Ebola outbreak and the violence outbreak coming together and really disrupting civilians' lives. And this is also a trend that we can now observe with regards to COVID-19. So ignoring calls for a global ceasefire, a lot of warring parties have increased activities, even openly attacking hospitals and health centers. And others have taken advantage of the reduced presence of state and international actors to operate and strengthen their stronghold, like in the Central African Republic and Mali, as mentioned by Mr. Lyammouri earlier. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, violent attacks rose by 37% between mid-March and mid-April, which is really significant and a trend to observe. And with regards to the direct impact on US peacekeeping operations, we've noticed, according to the latest available data, that the overall number of infections and deaths within the UN has been quite low, so respectively 137 confirmed cases and 2 deaths. But troop rotations have been suspended. Additional restrictions on the movement of personnel and equipment have hampered operations and minimized interaction with local populations. So for instance, if we take the example of the Central African Republic, we've noticed that human rights monitoring has decreased as there has been a reduction in assessments and protection missions because the UN staff essentially faced difficulty in accessing those communities to evaluate abuse. Additionally, we've seen an anti-UN discourse being reported in several countries, including DRC and South Sudan, with staff worrying about risks of civil unrest and protests against the UN. So the UN really had to adapt to this changing security environment, including by engaging in COVID-19 awareness campaigns and supporting public health efforts. And so to conclude, I really want to talk about 3 main long-term ramifications that might jeopardize the UN's peacekeeping role over the coming years. So first of all, these socioeconomic and political shocks threaten to undermine state institutions and fragile peace agreements, reversing UN efforts to establish sustainable peace and creating the risk of new violence. Second of all, facing a global recession, UN member states are likely to cut back on the US peacekeeping budget, which, if I'm not mistaken, was projected to be just over $6 billion for the upcoming year, while also reducing financing for broader conflict prevention and peace-building efforts. And lastly, the antagonisms opposing members within the Security Council have also prevented a collective security response to COVID-19. So while the permanent members of the Council have generally continued to cooperate on existing peace operations, including routine extensions of mandates, a new Cold War could make it harder for the Council to agree on the terms for new operations. So basically what we have is tensions and conflicts aggravated by the pandemic, which could, on one hand, increase the demand for large-scale UN peacekeeping operations, and on the other hand, financial pressures arising for the economic recession, which may push the UN to prioritize smaller-scale mechanisms as affordable alternatives. So the UN and its member states really need to work together to identify new crisis management tools that are both financially and politically feasible in the shadow of COVID-19, and to really adopt a holistic and inclusive approach spanning the multiple dimensions of insecurity, ranging from financial to food and health insecurity, in order to allow for the diffusion of acute conflict drivers and prevent the deepening of grievances.
Thank you, Salma. Before giving the floor to Leonardo, let me just share with you my question for the second part of this webinar, so that you can prepare some of your thoughts. I will ask you about how to serve better international peace and security. Is it by strengthening the role of the United Nations and its means, including through cooperations with African Union and its regional economic commissions? Is it by building a regional and enhancing regional multilateralism? Or is it by some sort of multilateralism à la carte? So these will be our focus on this second part of this webinar. But before doing that, let me invite Leonardo to make his contribution, and while appreciating the fact that he consented to give priority to Salma. So please, Leonardo, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very glad to share this important space with all the panelists. I commend all the contributions made so far that have been really helpful to broaden our image on how the UN can have a more impactful role when it comes to peace and security. Now I would like to provide a slightly different angle in this approach and start to look at the role of the youth when it comes to peace and security, and how the youth is a really important force for this matter. So first of all, I think it's important to see the recent Security Council resolutions regarding youth peace and security. It started in 2015 with the resolution 2250. Then it was followed by resolution 2419, and recently, just a couple of months ago, we had resolution 2535. Now that we have 3 resolutions in youth peace and security in a matter of 5 years, it's a big progress. It highlights how the role of youth is being seen as something important when it comes to peace building. And there are different pillars, including here, with some of them being protection and participation as key drivers of this transformation in peace and security. Now, what I see as a big problem is that while the resolutions create some pathways to really be able to move forward, without the real commitment from member states, there are not going to be any actionable plans and projects to transform the realities in these countries. And for me, that's one of the key points. It's not only about having some policies that create a nice framework for young people to participate, but it's also creating enabling spaces for that to happen. And we need to look at the statistics. So globally, the youth is 1.8 billion people. And with such a figure, we need to take into account how much we can catalyze all the potential that is contained there. And this needs to go hand in hand with a recent report by the World Bank and the UN called Pathways for Peace, when instead of jumping into a violent conflict once it has emerged, is looking at the root causes of that conflict and starting from a prevention point. And what will be better to really prevent conflict than engaging the current and upcoming generations in this effort? And for me, that's one of the key pillars. How can we create better partnerships for peace? And in these partnerships, making sure young people are having a relevant role. Coming back to some other statistics, out of the nearly 900 peace agreements that have been signed in recent years, none of them had included a really strong element of youth focus as a part of it. And leaving the youth behind when it comes to a peace agreement, taking into account that the youth are the ones inheriting these countries, it's a very complicated issue, because how can you feel that these results belong to you if you're not participating there? So that's a really important point, that we really need to have the youth owning the whole process of peace building. So that's one element, but also we need to look at what the youth is already doing when it comes to peace building and peace processes. So last year we had celebrated the first international symposium on the role of young people in peace processes that took part in Helsinki. And we had a report issued where it highlighted how young people can contribute, both sitting at the decision-making table, around the table, providing some guidance to the negotiators, and then outside the table, influencing what is being negotiated there through creative actions like nonviolent protests and different mechanisms in which some new ideas can be brought to the table. And that showed that this topic was not taken into account, that the role of young people was already happening, but was not really seen and was not really visible when it comes to creating this framework for peace and security. So that was a stepping stone to start to see that there's a lot of potential in investing resources in young peace builders to start to transform their communities and prevent conflict from arising. Now, when we look at the Security Council and what they're doing, I believe that the progress is quite slow, and I will tell you why. So today, for example, is the first time in the history of the Security Council that a matter of peace and security regarding young people, it's going to be discussed. So today we're going to have a briefing about the situation of young people in Colombia, and it's going to discuss how the massacres occurring against young people in the recent months, where more than 50 young people have been assassinated in massacres happening all over the country. That's the first time that this is reaching this kind of space, not only for Colombia, but in general for any country where young people have been affected. And the fact that it's taking such long time for these kind of spaces to happen, but also that these issues are discussed without even one young person taking part in this space. It doesn't really make much sense, and it doesn't really allow for a sustained and collaborative progress to occur. What I want to highlight with this is that in order for the Security Council to be more meaningful, in order for the UN to really represent the views of the whole population, it needs to take inclusivity to the next level. And by that, I mean making sure that minority groups are participating in the formulation of this peace and are active contributors to it. That women, peace and security agenda and the youth and peace and security agenda are part of the conversation and are integral to any plan that it's moving forward. And through these efforts, we can start to protect real lives that are being affected. Otherwise, as in Colombian case, we might have these beautiful resolutions that look good if they were implemented, but without a conscious effort of local governments to move forward with them, we will keep having the scourge of war and the scourge of violence affecting young people and not allowing ourselves to be the transformers of the reality of our country. So I will conclude there my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo, for your contribution, and thank you for the emphasis that you made on youth and the necessity to include them not only in terms of attention, but in terms of participation, real effective participation to the dialogue and the decision making. And you will all agree with me that this applies to youth, but it applies also to women. Women in peace and security, their role is extremely pivotal. It's important not only in negotiating a good peace agreement, but also in the phase of national reconciliation and consolidation of peace. We are left with less than the time that we have consumed, and we have a very important questions also to address. So I will not make any remarks or any additional consideration on what has been said, and we move to how to render service to international peace and security. Is it by making the United Nations much better than it is? Is it by building regional multilateralism, or is it by accepting or acquiescing to multilateralism à la carte? So I will begin with Mr. Lyammouri, and we move to Dr. Adeto, and then Leonardo, and finally Salma will accept to have the last word. Mr. Lyammouri, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think it would depend on the region, depend on the conflict, on how to approach peacekeeping to address peace and security issues. Again, if I speak very specifically about my geographic area of focus on Mali and the Sahel region, I would say I think one of the issues that MINUSMA could have done, and peacekeeping operations could have done there, is to have a long-term strategy to contribute to development in conflict-affected areas. If we look at the areas where the mission has the main bases and main presence, some of the sources of ongoing conflicts are related to lack of development, lack of infrastructure, public services. So I think if peacekeeping missions come with a strategy in hand that they're gonna be there for at least a decade, I think there is a way that they could make some long-term goals while they are there to improve, for example, the infrastructure of these areas. This, when I say infrastructure, could be access to electricity, access to water, the infrastructure in terms of like healthcare, etc. Those are some of the issues that are the sources of some ongoing conflict. So while you are there and trying to do some very quick impact projects, and you're basically trying to plug holes where the water is coming out, of course, eventually that hole is going to be destroyed again. But then if you try to construct and you have a long-term strategy, I think you will most likely have better results than just trying to plug those holes. In addition to that, and peacekeeping operation in Mali is not very popular among the local population. We have seen protests in the country asking the UN peacekeeping mission to leave. To avoid that, I think addressing some of those issues and grievances will change the perception from the local population towards the peacekeeping operation, and they will support them rather than throwing rocks at them when they are patrolling and going through the town. So this is just briefly my humble opinion on how to improve peacekeeping operations in Mali, at least. And I'm looking forward to hear others' opinions.
Thank you, Mr. Lyammouri, for his contribution. I think you emphasize the importance of having a viable and very inclusive peace agreement, and to see in terms of long-term development for remote areas, because this is really one of the basic reasons for which
points who really hit the nail on the head regarding international peace and security, particularly when you just address the issues with the United Nations. Yes, sir, to be honest, the African Union, with all its shortcomings, with all its limitations, still, it is hope for regional peace and security provider. And this year's TANA forum that we are organizing, which is going to be launched next week, the focus is AFCFTA, that is African Free Trade Area, that is African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a mechanism of bringing Pan-Africanism, that the one you mentioned earlier, African-led solution. We don't even modified it by saying African-led solution, because African problems have global roots from the very beginning. And definitely African Union, with its RECs, regional economic communities and regional mechanisms, is definitely paying special attention now through different these structural issues are even global. You have already some countries which were already destined to be destitute, poor, always in violence. And then you have the small arms and light weapons, because these light weapons are manufactured in the south, north, exported to the south, and then south, that is Africa particularly, becomes a crucible, a place where conflict is taking place and money is made for those armed dealers as well. To be honest, that is a very crucial issue. Women's and youth issue, which we already raised earlier, this, as we already framed them as societal threats, because their inclusivity is extremely important. So, and if you really leave anyone behind, injustice is being performed, being done. So injustice anywhere is injustice anywhere, everywhere. So I think we really have to focus, so through national, sub-regional, and regional mechanism, then of course we can create those cooperations through, as we said, it's multilateralism, which is to be taken as new multilateralism, new approach. Then the United Nations could possibly be strengthened. I should really cut it short and then just come back to you.
Thank you, Doctor. And I give the floor to Leonardo, and prepare Salma to make your last, to say the last word. Mr. Leonardo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And here I would like to make a couple of points. First one is that multilateralism needs to happen with a sense of interconnectedness. And here we are in an event that was created by the Policy Center for the New South. So I would like to also give a perspective from the global South and some philosophy that might be helpful to frame my point. So I believe it's important that we take into account concepts like Ubuntu, that I am because you are, and also apply that to the international policy. Like was mentioned before, the problems of one country are not independent, but are part of a web of different connections of international trade, international policy. And as such, I believe that while the UN plays a significant role at a local level as well, we need to see all the different actors that are involved, both in peace building, both in security maintenance, and both in the development of this particular country. Now, what happens many times is that in terms of decision makers, a lot of these groups are left behind. Women are left behind, the youth are left behind, native population is left behind. And this creates an environment that is not enabling for the most innovative solutions to emerge. So what I believe is really key here, and really can help to strengthen this multilateralism approach, is basically to look at the local context and see what the local groups are already doing, and fostering more partnerships. And by that, I not only mean partnerships between the government and regional and multilateral bodies, but also civil society, organizations, the academia, private sector. When they start to come together, we can see big results developing. Just to give an example, with the peace agreement that was signed recently in Colombia, when we started to see that larger kind of partnerships emerged, it had a real impact in how the peace agreement was moving forward. So for the ex-combatants who were transitioning to civic life, they had the support of the private sector to start some of their entrepreneurship ideas. Some of them started to develop, for example, handcraft beer. And to do so, they had support from universities. The government was also involved there. Multilateral actors who were guaranteeing the implementation of the peace agreement, as well as civil society who were helping them to spread the word about the business projects that they were developing. So this is an uncommon partnership that emerged, and yet it had such power to really move forward and create a fertile soil for peace to grow and blossom. So my invitation will be for us to start to look for these unlikely partnerships for peace to start to emerge, and don't hesitate to invite actors that we normally not take into consideration for these dialogues, because of course there are going to be difficult conversations. The approach of youth might be different from that of the political elite, and yet when mixed together is when we can have better long-term results. So that would be my piece of advice in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo. Now, Salma, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. And it was very interesting to hear all of your thoughts on the matter. I really think that all of the reforms that we need to think about need to address the structural weaknesses that we've identified in the UN, but also capitalize on its strategic strength and established legacy. So I also think that regional multilateralism does enjoy a certain level of legitimacy among local populations. It is less likely to be seen as disruptive and perhaps alien. And regional actors are also more likely to understand the political, social, historic, and cultural context, and therefore to offer solutions that are more adequately tailored. However, this also requires the willingness and the capacity of neighboring countries to intervene and to commit to years, perhaps, of peacekeeping operations or any other form of intervention. And I think that another, perhaps, reform to think about is that of implementing more regional preventive mechanisms to diffuse conflicts before their escalation. So these include, for instance, mediation, early warning mechanisms, security sector reforms, but also regional development programs that address structural inequalities, which often form the root causes of conflicts. So when we're not paying attention to underlying drivers of conflicts, we might succeed in containing but not resolving a conflict. And a very famous example of that might be the Indo-Pakistani ceasefire agreements. The UN has managed to deter violations, but the international community has not necessarily resolved the conflict. And so this explains a little bit why many experts and vocal proponents of nationalism are questioning the very raison d'etre of the UN. But this sometimes translates an inaccurate understanding of the mission of the UN. For the founders of the UN never had this utopist vision of completely eradicating conflicts or embodying a world government capable of taking supranational decisions. And the first Secretary General of the UN famously said that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind whenever evaluating the role of the UN, to truly appreciate its added value and to think about ways of further improving it over the long term.
Thank you, Salma. I think that we have managed, honestly, I must confess that we did not mean to have this very comprehensive and thoughtful discussion, but I think we managed to have first a broad consideration that were presented by Dr. Adeto. We had the challenges by Salma. We had an experience on the ground, Mali, that was presented with Mr. Lyammouri. And we had from the other angle, the voice, let's say, of the voiceless, the voice of civil society, of NGOs that came from the emerging leader, Leonardo. We didn't mean it, but I think that we managed to achieve this very good chemistry in this presentation. I know that we did not exhaust all the dimensions of peace and security as a stronghold of the United Nations, but I think we came closer to just emphasizing the most important element. And I think beyond the United Nations, multilateralism that some of you mentioned is not only about structures and operations. It is about state of mind. It is about a style of addressing international relations. It is a set of values and principles of justice, equity, equality, solidarity, which are challenged nowadays. Because of shortage of the time, we could not really, I know that all of you are frustrated because we did not touch upon some important elements, but I promise that the second session that will be dealing with the UN and the challenge of economic and social development will try to cover as much areas as we tried to cover, and there will be a contribution to this celebration of the 75th anniversary of the UN. I thank you, all of you, for participating with your to this this webinar, and please keep safe. And I hope we will interact with you shortly.